The rope hung against the limestone face of Hacksaw Ridge like a lifeline to hell itself, its fibers already darkening with the morning rain that had turned the Okinawan clay into treacherous mud. Private First Class Desmond Doss tested the knots one final time, his calloused hands working with the methodical precision of a man who understood that rope failure meant death for whoever trusted it. Below him, the 77th Infantry Division's aid station buzzed with controlled chaos as stretcher-bearers prepared for another day of receiving the broken bodies that would soon descend from the plateau above. "That rope's gonna snap before noon," Sergeant Howell muttered, spitting into the mud as he watched Doss secure the anchor points. "You mark my words, Doss. That contraption ain't meant for what you're fixing to do with it." But Desmond's attention remained fixed on the cliff face, studying the route he'd climbed 17 times the night before. Each descent had burned the image deeper into his memory, handholds worn smooth by desperate fingers, ledges barely wide enough for a wounded man's stretcher, the terrible mathematics of weight and friction that determined who lived and who didn't make it down. The rope bore scorch marks from shrapnel and dark stains that could have been blood, mud, or both. The orders had come through at 400. Withdraw to defensive positions below the ridge and wait for artillery support that might not arrive for hours. Standard procedure dictated leaving the wounded who couldn't walk, marking their positions for later recovery if the tactical situation allowed. But Desmond Doss had never been standard procedure, and the voices calling "medic" from the darkness above had made retreat impossible for a man whose conscience weighed more than his fear. "Doss, you listening?" Lieutenant Gonto appeared beside them, his uniform crisp despite the circumstances. "Division wants casualty counts by 0800. How many did you bring down?" 17 confirmed, sir. Maybe more scattered in the cave mouths." The lieutenant's expression shifted between admiration and something that might have been irritation. 3 weeks on Okinawa had taught him that Desmond Doss complicated every tactical decision, turning routine withdrawals into moral dilemmas and transforming what should have been acceptable losses into impossible rescue missions. The men loved him for it. The officers found him exhausting. 17, Gonto repeated, scribbling in his field notebook. "In one night, without firing a single shot." "Yes, sir." "You realize that rope of yours is held together with medical tape and prayer?" Desmond's hands paused on the anchor knot, and for a moment something flickered across his face that might have been doubt. The rope had nearly failed twice during the night, once sending him and a wounded corporal sliding 20 feet before friction arrested their fall. His shoulders still ached from the impact, and his palms bore rope burns that made gripping anything an exercise in controlled pain. "It'll hold, sir." "Will it? Because if that thing breaks with you on it, I lose my best medic, and if it breaks with a wounded man on it, it won't break." The certainty in his voice surprised even Doss himself. Faith, his grandmother had taught him, meant acting as if impossible things were simply delayed truths. But standing at the edge of Hacksaw Ridge with artillery rumbling in the distance, Faith felt less like certainty and more like stubborn refusal to accept the mathematics of war. Corporal Martinez approached from the aid station, his leg still wrapped in the field dressing Doss had applied 12 hours earlier. 3 days ago, Martinez had been among the loudest voices questioning whether an unarmed medic belonged in a rifle company. Now he moved with the careful gait of someone whose life had been measured in rope lengths and prayer. "Doss," Martinez called softly. "Doc Peterson wants to check your hands. Says rope burns can get infected fast in this climate. Later. Also says thank you for Johnson and the others." Desmond nodded without looking away from the cliff face. Gratitude made him uncomfortable, especially when it came wrapped in statistics and survival rates. 17 men lowered to safety sounded heroic, until you remembered the ones who hadn't made it to the rope, the voices that had grown weaker through the night before finally going silent. The rain intensified, turning the rope slick and treacherous. Somewhere above, beyond the rim of the ridge, machine gun positions waited in caves that honeycomb the coral limestone. Intelligence reports suggested the Japanese had withdrawn during the night, but intelligence had been wrong before. The only certainty was that wounded Americans lay scattered across the plateau, and standard operating procedure said to leave them until the tactical situation improved. "Sir," Doss turned to Lieutenant Gaunto, "permission to make one more climb before the weather gets worse." "Negative. Orders are to hold this position and—" A voice drifted down from the ridge above, weak and desperate. "Medic, somebody help me." The sound cut through military protocol like shrapnel through canvas. Every man at the aid station froze, recognizing the universal cry that transcended rank, unit designation, and tactical doctrine. Someone up there was still alive, still calling for help that might never come if they followed orders and waited for the all-clear. Desmond's hands moved to the rope before his mind had fully processed the decision. This was how it always happened. Not as conscious heroism, but as automatic response, muscle memory, trained by conscience rather than field manuals. The voice above could belong to anyone, a rifleman from his own company, a replacement whose name he'd never learned, an enemy soldier calling out in English, learned from captured phrase books. "Doss, don't you dare!" Sergeant Howell grabbed his arm. "That's an order." "I can't leave him, Sarge." "You can, and you will. That ridge is crawling with Japs, the weather's turning bad, and that rope's held more weight than it was ever designed for." But Desmond was already checking his aid bag, inventorying bandages and morphine syrettes with the focused attention of someone who had learned to function beyond the boundaries of fear. The rope would hold, because it had to hold. The weather would cooperate because anything else was unthinkable. Faith, he was discovering, sometimes looked exactly like professional stubbornness. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The ascent began in silence, broken only by the soft scrape of boots against wet limestone and the distant rumble of artillery that might have been thunder. Desmond Doss climbed with the methodical rhythm he'd perfected through the long night. Test each handhold, distribute weight evenly, never look down at the aid station growing smaller below. The rope cut into his burned palms, but pain had become just another piece of equipment to manage, like the weight of his medical bag or the persistent ache in his shoulders. Halfway up the cliff face, he paused to listen. The voice that had drawn him back to the ridge had gone silent, which could mean rescue, death, or simple exhaustion. On Okinawa, silence carried as much information as sound, sometimes more. The Japanese defenders had learned to use quiet as a weapon, waiting in their cave positions until American soldiers relaxed into carelessness before opening fire with devastating precision. "Come on," Doss whispered to himself, a prayer that had become his climbing mantra. Just one more. Always just one more. Below him, the 77th Infantry Division's temporary aid station buzzed with controlled tension. Sergeant Howell paced the perimeter like a caged animal, periodically glancing up at the rope that disappeared over the rim of the ridge. 3 stretcher-bearers sat cleaning their equipment with the obsessive attention of men who needed something to do with their hands. Lieutenant Gaunto studied his maps and radio, calculating the tactical implications of one medic's moral stubbornness. The weather was deteriorating exactly as predicted. Rain fell in sheets now, turning the clay soil into slippery mud and reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Artillery positions below the ridge reported difficulty targeting suspected enemy locations through the weather, and resupply convoys struggled on the muddy roads that connected the front lines to rear areas. This was Okinawa at its worst, a landscape that fought both armies with equal enthusiasm. Doss reached the rim of the ridge as the rain intensified. The plateau stretched before him like a moonscape. Shell craters filled with murky water, shattered tree stumps, equipment scattered by the previous night's fighting. Everything looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, less dramatic than the hellscape his memory had constructed from darkness and muzzle flashes. He found the voice's owner wedged behind a fallen log, near what had once been a Japanese observation post. Private Collins, 19 years old, from somewhere in Texas that he talked about constantly. His right leg bent at an angle that violated anatomy, and his face had gone the waxy pale color that meant serious blood loss. But his eyes tracked movement, and when he saw Doss approaching with the aid bag, something like hope flickered across his features. "Thought you guys left," Collins whispered. "Nobody gets left behind." The words came automatically, though Doss wondered if he really believed them anymore. 17 men evacuated the night before. But how many had they left behind? How many voices had called out from positions too exposed to reach, too dangerous to risk additional casualties attempting rescue? The mathematics of triage haunted every medic's decisions, but some equations felt too heavy to carry. Collins' leg required immediate attention, a compound fracture that had already soaked through 2 field dressings. Doss worked quickly, applying a tourniquet and fresh bandages while his ears stayed tuned to the plateau around them. The rain provided cover, masking sound and reducing visibility, but it also made every movement treacherous and turned the rope into a potentially lethal liability. "How many others are up here?" Doss asked as he worked. "Don't know. Heard voices earlier, but..." Collins gestured weakly toward the far end of the plateau. Thompson and Rodriguez were working their way toward that cave system when the mortars started. Haven't seen them since. More voices, more decisions, more weight for a rope that was already straining beyond its design limits. Doss finished his work on Collins and began the delicate process of rigging a harness that would distribute the wounded man's weight during the descent. Medical tape, rifle slings, and torn uniform fabric became improvised equipment, held together by field expedients and whatever grace kept impossible things functioning long enough to matter. The descent with Collins took 23 minutes. 23 minutes of hand-over-hand climbing while supporting dead weight. 23 minutes of praying that shrapnel hadn't weakened the rope's core fibers. 23 minutes of listening for sounds that might indicate enemy movement in the cave mouths that honeycombed the cliff face. When they finally reached the bottom, Doss's hands shook uncontrollably from exhaustion and adrenaline. 18, Sergeant Howell announced, as stretcher-bearers carried Collins toward the aid station. "That makes 18 men you've brought down from that ridge." But Doss was already studying the cliff face again, calculating the route to the cave system Collins had mentioned. Thompson and Rodriguez. 2 more names, 2 more voices that might be calling for help from positions no tactical manual would recommend attempting to reach. The rope hung against the limestone like an accusation, challenging him to define the boundaries of responsibility and faith. Lieutenant Gaunto appeared beside him, rain dripping from his helmet. "Doss, I'm ordering you to stand down. That rope's compromised, the weather's getting worse, and we've got reports of enemy movement in those caves." "How many reports, sir?" "Enough to make this suicidal, but not confirmed." The distinction mattered. Unconfirmed reports meant fear and second-hand rumors. Confirmed reports meant genuine intelligence about enemy positions and strength. On Okinawa, the difference between those categories determined who lived and who got left behind, when tactical situations demanded impossible choices. "Doss," the lieutenant's voice carried the weight of command and something that might have been genuine concern. "You've done enough, more than enough. Nobody expects you to..." "Thompson and Rodriguez expect me to." The names hung in the air between them, heavier than military protocol. Every officer learned to think in terms of acceptable losses and strategic priorities, but individual names had a way of complicating those calculations. Thompson, who wrote letters to his mother every night. Rodriguez, who shared his rations with anyone who looked hungry. Personalities became problems when tactical doctrine required treating people as statistics. The rain continued, turning the plateau above into a muddy nightmare, and the rope into an increasingly dangerous gamble. But somewhere up there, two voices might still be calling for help that would never come if Doss obeyed orders and waited for conditions to improve. Faith, he was learning, often looked exactly like professional insubordination. The rope snapped at precisely 13:47 hours, 20 feet above the aid station, while Doss was rigging a pulley system from salvaged equipment straps. The sound, a sharp crack like a rifle shot, froze every conversation and sent Sergeant Howell diving for cover before his brain processed that they weren't under fire. The severed end fell against the limestone face with a wet slap, leaving 47 feet of frayed hemp dangling uselessly, while the plateau above remained as unreachable as the moon. "Well, hell," Howell muttered, emerging from behind a supply crate. "There goes your miracle rope, Doss." But Desmond was already studying the cliff face with the calculating attention of an engineer solving an equation. Communication wire still ran along the ridge from the previous night's operations, damaged but anchored at both ends. Field telephone cable, thinner than climbing rope but rated for substantial tensile strength. Equipment straps from damaged packs could serve as reinforcement. Medical tape might hold spliced connections long enough to matter. Corporal Martinez approached, with two stretcher-bearers in tow. His leg wound had reopened during the morning's movement, and he walked with the careful gait of someone managing controlled pain. But his expression carried something Doss had begun to recognize. The look of men who had stopped questioning the impossible and started accepting it as standard operating procedure. "Doc Peterson wants to see you," Martinez said. "Says your hands need proper medical attention before they get infected." "Later?" "Also says those rope burns are deeper than you're letting on. Says a medic who can't use his hands isn't much use to anybody." Doss paused in his examination of the communication wire. His palms had gone raw and bloody during the night's operations, and every grip sent sharp pain up his forearms. But Thompson and Rodriguez remained somewhere on the plateau above, and infected hands seemed like a problem for tomorrow, while their voices were a problem for right now. Lieutenant Gonto appeared with a field radio and a frown that suggested bad news. Intelligence reports were coming in from other sectors of the Okinawan campaign. Heavy enemy concentrations in cave systems throughout the region. Coordinated resistance from positions that seemed impossible to assault directly. The 77th Infantry Division was being asked to hold current positions while artillery attempted to reduce fortified positions that might or might not contain significant enemy forces. "Doss," the lieutenant's voice carried new urgency. "Division intelligence confirms enemy activity in those caves. Large numbers, well positioned, probably preparing for a counterattack." "Confirm numbers, sir?" "Estimates suggest company strength or better." Estimates, another word that meant fear and uncertainty dressed up as tactical intelligence. But company strength, if accurate, meant machine guns, mortars, and coordinated fields of fire that would turn the plateau into a killing ground. Even Doss understood the mathematics. One medic with improvised equipment versus 100 entrenched defenders was suicide, not rescue. The rain continued, turning afternoon into premature twilight and reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Radio communications crackled with reports from other units, casualties mounting, ammunition running low, requests for medical evacuation that couldn't be fulfilled because weather had grounded aircraft and made road movement treacherous. But somewhere above, two voices might be growing weaker while tactical doctrine demanded waiting for better conditions that might never arrive. Doss began splicing communication wire with equipment straps, his burned hands working despite the pain that made every movement an exercise in controlled stubbornness. The improvised line would be thinner than the original rope, less forgiving of mistakes, more likely to fail under the weight of a wounded man. But thin line was better than no line, and probable failure was better than certain abandonment. "Son!" Sergeant Howell settled beside him with the careful attention of someone approaching a dangerous animal. You're thinking about going back up there with that contraption? Thompson and Rodriguez are still up there. Maybe. Or maybe they're prisoners. Or maybe they're already dead. Or maybe those voices you heard belong to Japs trying to draw you into an ambush. All possibilities. All reasonable tactical considerations. All arguments that made perfect sense until you tried to imagine explaining them to Thompson's mother or Rodriguez's wife. Military necessity always sounded logical until it collided with individual names and faces that wouldn't cooperate with statistical thinking. The improvised line took 2 hours to assemble. Communication wire spliced with equipment straps, reinforced with medical tape, anchored to the same limestone outcropping that had held the original rope through 17 previous descents. It looked fragile and improvised because it was fragile and improvised, held together by field expedients and whatever faith kept impossible things functioning when people needed them most. "Testing weight now," Doss announced, wrapping the line around his waist. "Like hell you are," Lieutenant Gornto grabbed his arm. "Doss, I'm giving you a direct order. Stand down and report to the aid station for medical attention." "Sir, with respect, Thompson and Rodriguez may already be dead. Probably are dead. And if you go up there with that piece of improvised junk, you'll be dead too. Then where does that leave the men who are definitely still alive down here?" The question hung between them like artillery smoke. Every medic learned to balance immediate needs against future possibilities, treating the wounded who could be saved while accepting the loss of those who couldn't. But where did that calculation put 2 voices calling from positions that might be reachable with enough stubbornness and improvised equipment? Thunder rolled across the ridge, or maybe artillery from another sector of the Okinawan campaign. In the growing darkness, it became impossible to distinguish natural weather from human violence. Both fell from the sky with equal indifference, turning the clay soil into treacherous mud and making every decision more complicated. "Sir," Doss said quietly, "I can't leave them up there if there's a chance." Can't or won't. Same thing in the end. The distinction mattered less than the mathematics of conscience. 2 voices against direct orders, probable suicide against certain abandonment, faith against tactical doctrine. Some equations couldn't be solved with military logic because they weren't military problems. They were questions about the weight a person could carry inside their own head for the rest of their life. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The improvised line held Doss's weight for exactly 14 minutes before the first splice began to separate. He felt it happen 40 feet above the aid station, a slight give in the tension, a subtle shift in the way the wire cut into his hands, the horrible certainty that failure was now measured in minutes rather than hours. Below him, the 77th Infantry Division's position had grown small and distant, while above him the rim of Hacksaw Ridge seemed to retreat with every upward movement. His burned palms had gone numb, which might have been a blessing, except that numb hands couldn't properly assess grip strength or detect the subtle changes in rope tension that warned of imminent failure. Blood made everything slippery. His own blood from reopened wounds mixing with rain to turn every handhold into a gamble. But Thompson and Rodriguez were up there somewhere, and turning back now meant abandoning them to whatever waited in the cave systems that honeycombed the plateau. The second splice failed at the rim. Doss felt the line part just as his boots found purchase on solid ground, sending him stumbling forward onto the muddy plateau, while 40 feet of wire and equipment straps tumbled into the void below. For a moment, he knelt in the mud, listening to the sounds of his lifeline disappearing and understanding that he was now committed to whatever came next. The plateau looked different in afternoon light. Rain had filled shell craters with murky water that reflected the sky like broken mirrors, and everything smelled of cordite, wet earth, and something organic that might have been death. Equipment lay scattered across the limestone. Helmets, packs, rifles abandoned when their owners fell or fled. The silence felt heavier than enemy fire, pregnant with possibilities that ranged from rescue to ambush. He found Thompson first, wedged behind a coral outcropping near what had once been a Japanese machine gun position. The rifleman was conscious but pale from blood loss, his left arm mangled by shrapnel and his breathing shallow with the effort of staying quiet. When he saw Doss approaching with the medical bag, his expression shifted from disbelief to something that might have been relief. "Thought I was dreaming," Thompson whispered. "Heard somebody calling down there but figured it was wishful thinking. Where's Rodriguez? Cave mouth maybe 50 yards that way. Took a bad hit when the mortar started. Haven't heard from him in hours." Doss worked quickly on Thompson's arm, applying fresh bandages and a morphine syringe while his ears stayed tuned to the sounds of the plateau around them. The rain provided acoustic cover, but it also masked the approach of enemy patrols that might be moving through the cave systems. Every few seconds he paused to listen for voices, footsteps, or the metallic sounds that indicated weapons being prepared for use. "How are we getting down from here?" Thompson asked as Doss finished his work. The question hung in the air like smoke. Without the rope, the cliff face became an impossible barrier. The original path up to the plateau had been overrun during the night's fighting, and enemy positions controlled every other approach. They were effectively marooned on a piece of contested ground, with no communication, no support, and no way back to friendly lines. "Working on that," Doss replied, though he had no idea how. Finding Rodriguez required crawling across 50 yards of open ground, while staying below the sightlines of cave mouths that might or might not contain enemy observers. The rifleman lay unconscious behind a fallen tree near a cave entrance, his breathing barely perceptible and his pulse thready with blood loss. Shrapnel had opened his chest in 3 places, and the field dressings he'd applied himself were soaked through with blood that had started to clot in the rain. Doss worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that unconscious patients couldn't cooperate with their own evacuation. Fresh bandages, another morphine syringe, improvised splinting for what looked like broken ribs. Rodriguez stirred briefly during treatment, his eyes opening long enough to register recognition before sliding shut again. "Rodriguez, can you hear me?" A slight nod. Enough to indicate consciousness, but not enough to suggest he could participate in whatever escape plan Doss might devise. From inside the cave came sounds that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. Human movement, perhaps, voices speaking in a language that wasn't English, the shuffle of equipment being repositioned. Doss froze, trying to distinguish between imagination and genuine threat while maintaining his work on Rodriguez's wounds. The sounds repeated, definitely human, definitely close, definitely not American. Doss finished his medical work and began the careful process of moving Rodriguez away from the cave mouth. 30 yards, 40. Enough distance to provide some concealment while he figured out how 3 wounded men were going to descend an 80-foot cliff face without ropes, equipment, or any means of communication with the aid station below. Thunder rumbled overhead, or maybe artillery from another sector. In the growing darkness, natural and human violence became indistinguishable. Both fell from the sky with equal indifference, turning the plateau into a muddy nightmare, where every decision carried the weight of lives that hung in the balance. The solution, when it came, was so simple it felt like divine inspiration or complete madness. Communication wire still ran along the cliff face, not the damaged section he'd used for climbing, but the original telephone line that connected observation posts. Thinner than climbing rope, but possibly strong enough to support controlled descents if the weight was distributed properly and the angle of descent minimized the shock loading. Doss found Thompson huddled behind the coral outcropping, his face gray with pain but his eyes alert. "Found a way down," he announced quietly. "Gonna be rough, but it beats staying up here. What about Rodriguez? We take him with us. He's unconscious, dead weight. If that wire breaks..." "It won't break." The words came out with more confidence than Doss felt. The telephone wire looked fragile and improvised because it was fragile and improvised, designed for communications rather than life support operations. But fragile possibility was better than certain death, and improvised escape was better than waiting for tactical conditions that might never improve. The descent began as enemy voices echoed from cave mouths across the plateau. Doss went first, wrapping the wire around his body to create friction and control his rate of descent, while Thompson lowered the unconscious Rodriguez using improvised harnesses made from rifle slings and torn equipment. Every few feet he paused to listen for sounds of pursuit or signs that the wire was approaching failure. Halfway down, the wire began to stretch ominously, not breaking, but elongating under load in a way that suggested imminent failure. Doss redistributed his weight against the cliff face, using handholds and ledges to reduce stress on the improvised line while maintaining control over their descent rate. "Hold on," he whispered upward to Thompson. "Something's changing." But there was no time to stop. Enemy voices were growing closer, and muzzle flashes had begun to light up the plateau above as Japanese patrols discovered the abandoned equipment that marked their recent position. The descent became a race between gravity, equipment failure, and whatever pursuit might be following them down the cliff face. When they finally reached bottom, all three men lay in the mud for several minutes, listening to their hearts pound and trying to process the fact that they were still alive. Above them, voices called out in Japanese, while flashlight beams probed the cliff face. But the wire had held, the wounded were safe, and the impossible had become just another piece of field expedience that worked because it had to work. The after-action report would say that Private First Class Desmond Doss evacuated 21 wounded personnel from contested terrain under enemy fire, demonstrating exceptional courage and devotion to duty. It would not mention that he spent 47 minutes at the bottom of Hacksaw Ridge, vomiting into a shell crater, while his hands shook uncontrollably and his mind replayed every moment when the improvised wire might have snapped, sending all three men plummeting to their deaths. It would not describe the way he wept quietly behind a supply crate while Doc Peterson cleaned and bandaged the rope burns that had reopened during the final descent. It would not record his whispered confession to Chaplain Bradley that he'd been terrified every moment on the plateau, praying constantly not for courage, but simply for his hands to stop shaking long enough to tie the knots that meant life or death for men who trusted him. The official citation would speak of unwavering faith and selfless heroism. The reality tasted like copper fear and felt like muscles that refused to stop trembling even hours after the danger had passed. Doss, Sergeant Howell, settled beside him as evening fell across the 77th Infantry Division's aid station. "You need to eat something." Doc's orders. Desmond stared at the sea rations without appetite. Food seemed like a luxury for people who weren't carrying 21 names in their head, 21 faces that would have died if equipment had failed or courage had given out at the wrong moment. The weight wasn't pride. It was responsibility for lives that hung by improvised wire and whatever grace kept impossible things working long enough to matter. "Sarge," he said quietly, "what if that wire had broken?" But it didn't. But what if it had? Rodriguez was unconscious. Thompson couldn't support his own weight. If that line had failed halfway down... Howell was quiet for a long moment, understanding that some questions couldn't be answered with military logic. Every combat operation balanced calculated risks against potential outcomes, but the mathematics became personal when individual names and faces were added to the equation. Success felt different when you understood how easily it could have become catastrophe. "Son," the sergeant said finally, "that wire held because you made it hold. Your knots, your technique, your stubborn refusal to accept that some things can't be done. Don't second-guess miracles." But miracles implied divine intervention, and Doss knew exactly how mechanical his rescue operations had been: rope tension and friction coefficients, weight distribution and anchor point integrity. Faith had provided the motivation, but physics had determined the outcomes. If the wire had parted under Rodriguez's weight, prayer wouldn't have stopped their fall. Lieutenant Gonto appeared with field reports and the expression that suggested mixed emotions about subordinates who ignored direct orders. 3 hours earlier, Doss had been guilty of insubordination that could have resulted in court-martial proceedings. Now he was being recommended for commendation, and the distinction between criminal disobedience and heroic initiative seemed to depend entirely on outcomes that could have gone either way. Doss, you know what you did up there was completely against orders. Yes, sir. You know that if things had gone wrong, if you'd been killed or captured, it would have compromised the entire unit's position. Yes, sir. You also know that Thompson and Rodriguez would be dead right now if you'd followed those orders. The statement hung between them like artillery smoke. Military discipline required obedience to lawful commands, but conscience sometimes demanded actions that contradicted tactical doctrine. The tension between those imperatives created impossible choices for soldiers whose convictions weighed more than their fear of military justice. Sir, Doss said carefully, I can't carry a weapon because of my beliefs, but I can't abandon wounded men for the same reason. Even when abandoning them is the tactically sound decision, especially then. The distinction mattered more than Lieutenant Gonto probably understood. Easy choices didn't require faith, they required only common sense and self-preservation instincts. But impossible choices, decisions that violated military logic and personal safety, revealed what a person truly believed when everything else was stripped away. Night fell across Hacksaw Ridge like a curtain, bringing silence that felt heavier than the day's gunfire. Somewhere above, Japanese patrols moved through cave systems that honeycombed the plateau, probably discovering equipment and blood trails that told the story of afternoon rescue operations. Tomorrow would bring new attacks, new casualties, new choices between tactical doctrine and impossible responsibility. But tonight, 21 names rested safely in aid stations and field hospitals because one medic had refused to accept that some people couldn't be saved. The wire had held, the knots had kept their integrity, and faith had proven stronger than physics, or maybe faith had simply provided the stubbornness necessary to make physics work beyond its normal parameters. Doc Peterson approached with fresh bandages and the expression of professional concern, mixed with something that might have been awe. 3 weeks of treating casualties from Hacksaw Ridge had taught him to distinguish between routine heroism and actions that transcended normal human limitations. What Doss had accomplished with improvised equipment and raw determination belonged in the second category. How are the hands feeling? Peterson asked, examining the rope burns that covered both palms. Fine, sir. They're not fine. These burns go almost to the bone in places. You won't have full grip strength for weeks, assuming they heal without complications. The news should have been alarming, but Doss felt only distant concern. Damaged hands seemed like a small price for 21 lives, and healing would happen or it wouldn't, depending on factors beyond his immediate control. Faith, he was learning, meant accepting both outcomes and consequences with equal grace. Doc, he asked quietly, how many of them will make it? All 21 should survive if we can get them to proper facilities. Thompson and Rodriguez need surgery, but they'll pull through. 21 lives, 21 families who wouldn't receive telegrams about sons and husbands killed in action on an obscure ridge in the Pacific. 21 names that would go home instead of being carved into memorial walls. The mathematics felt impossible, too large for one person's actions to have generated such outcomes, but the rope burns on his hands provided tangible evidence that impossible things happened when faith collided with stubborn refusal to accept unacceptable choices. Wire had held beyond its rated capacity because someone needed it to hold. Knots had maintained integrity because lives depended on their strength. Physics had cooperated with prayer because anything else was unthinkable. The legend would say that Private First Class Desmond Doss single-handedly evacuated 21 wounded soldiers from Hacksaw Ridge, demonstrating exceptional courage under fire. The reality was simpler and more complicated. One medic who couldn't abandon voices calling for help, even when abandoning them was the reasonable thing to do. 37 years later, Desmond Doss would stand in his garden in Rising Fawn, Georgia, listening to rain drum against the roof of his tool shed, and the sound would take him back to Hacksaw Ridge so completely that his hands would begin to shake. Not with palsy or age, but with the muscle memory of gripping improvised wire while praying that physics would cooperate with faith long enough for 21 names to reach safety. The Congressional Medal of Honor sat in a frame on his mantelpiece, presented by President Truman with words about extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty. But the medal felt lighter than the memory of Rodriguez's blood on his hands, lighter than the sound Thompson made when he thought he was going to die on a plateau 80 feet above safety. Official citations weighed less than private nightmares about wire that might have snapped at any moment. "Grandpa," his grandson would ask, studying the photograph of young soldiers posed beneath a cliff that looked impossibly steep, "were you really scared up there?" And Doss would pause in his work, remembering the taste of copper fear and the way his hands had trembled while tying knots that meant life or death for men who trusted him with everything they had. The legend said he was fearless. The reality was that he'd been terrified every moment, praying constantly not for courage, but simply for his equipment to hold and his hands to stop shaking long enough to do what needed doing. "Son," he would say carefully, "being scared is what made me careful. Careful men tie better knots." Back on Okinawa, in the hours after the last evacuation, the 77th Infantry Division prepared for whatever came next. Intelligence reports suggested Japanese counterattacks were imminent, and casualty projections for the continuing campaign made sobering reading. Hacksaw Ridge represented just one small engagement in a larger battle that would consume thousands of lives before its conclusion. But 21 families would receive letters instead of telegrams, and 21 names would come home to write their own stories about gardens and grandchildren and the strange mathematics of grace that determined who lived and who died when wire held beyond its rated capacity. Sergeant Howell found Doss at dawn, sitting beside the aid station with his hands wrapped in fresh bandages and his eyes focused on something beyond the horizon. 3 weeks of combat had taught the sergeant to recognize the look of men processing experiences that civilian language couldn't adequately describe. Some things could only be carried in silence, turned over in memory until their edges wore smooth enough to handle. "Division's moving us to a new sector tomorrow," Howell announced. "Different ridge, probably same problems." "More wire," Doss said quietly. "What?" "We'll need more communication wire and equipment straps. Medical tape doesn't hold splices under full load." The practical details mattered because they were manageable, unlike the larger questions about providence and courage that defied military analysis. Better knots, stronger materials, improved anchor points. These were problems that could be solved with field expedients and careful attention to engineering principles. Lieutenant Gaunto appeared with morning reports and news that would reshape the tactical situation. Japanese resistance was stiffening across all sectors of the Okinawan campaign, and medical evacuation capabilities were being stretched beyond their normal limits. Units like theirs would be expected to maintain higher levels of self-sufficiency, treating and evacuating casualties with whatever resources they could improvise from local materials. "Doss!" The lieutenant's voice carried new respect, mixed with something that might have been wariness. "Division wants to know if your rope techniques can be standardized for other units, training protocols, equipment specifications, that sort of thing." The request made sense from an operational perspective. If improvised evacuation methods could be systematized and taught to other medics, casualties across the theater might be reduced. But standardizing miracles seemed like a contradiction in terms. Faith didn't follow training manuals, and grace couldn't be requisitioned through supply channels. "Sir," Doss said carefully, "it's just rope work. Physics and common sense, any competent medic could do the same thing with proper materials." But that wasn't entirely true, and everyone understood the distinction. Technical competence was teachable, but the stubborn refusal to abandon wounded men, when abandonment was the reasonable choice, belonged to a different category entirely. Some things couldn't be standardized because they emerged from convictions that individual consciences had to discover for themselves. Doc Peterson joined them with coffee and medical reports that provided statistical context for the previous day's operations. 21 evacuations from terrain that conventional doctrine would have classified as unreachable. 0 additional casualties during evacuation operations that could easily have resulted in multiple deaths. Injury patterns consistent with successful triage under extreme conditions. "Doss," Peterson said quietly, "I've been treating combat casualties for 2 years. What you did yesterday, I'm not sure I understand how it worked." "Physics, sir. Rope tension, weight distribution, anchor point integrity." "Is that all?" The question hung between them like smoke from distant artillery. Physics explained the mechanical aspects, why wire held, how knots distributed stress, where anchor points needed to be positioned for maximum strength. But physics couldn't account for the choice to climb an 80-foot cliff face with improvised equipment while enemy patrols moved through cave systems above. "Sir," Doss said finally, "I couldn't leave them up there." Couldn't? Or wouldn't? Same thing in the end. Years later, historians would analyze the Hacksaw Ridge operations in terms of tactical innovations and medical evacuation procedures. Military manuals would include sections on improvised rescue techniques using communication wire and field equipment. Training programs would teach medics how to assess cliff faces for evacuation routes and calculate load limits for emergency anchoring systems. But the textbooks would struggle with the human variables that made mechanical solutions possible. How do you teach the kind of faith that treats impossible things as simply delayed outcomes? How do you standardize the stubborn refusal to accept that some people can't be saved? How do you train soldiers to hear voices calling for help from positions that doctrine says are unreachable? The rain stopped as morning advanced, revealing a landscape scarred by the previous day's fighting, but somehow more hopeful in the growing light. Steam rose from shell craters as the sun began to dry mud that had been treacherous for hours. Equipment salvage teams moved across the plateau above, recovering weapons and personal effects left behind during the chaos of combat and evacuation. Somewhere in the distance, artillery continued its methodical work, preparing positions for assaults that might succeed or fail depending on variables too complex for any individual soldier to control. But 21 men who should have died on Hacksaw Ridge were breathing morning air instead of occupying graves, and that simple fact seemed to tip some cosmic balance toward hope rather than despair. Doss stood slowly, his bandaged hands making every movement deliberate. Tomorrow would bring new ridges, new casualties, new choices between tactical doctrine and impossible responsibility. There would be more wire to splice, more knots to tie, more voices calling for help from positions that shouldn't be reachable with available equipment and reasonable caution. But wire could be spliced, knots could be tied. Voices could be answered by medics who refused to accept that some people couldn't be saved. Physics would cooperate with faith, or faith would provide the stubbornness necessary to make physics work beyond its normal parameters. Either way, the mathematics of grace would continue to produce outcomes that defied military logic and transformed individual choices into legends that somehow felt lighter than the memories they compressed. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.